First of all, it'd be fascinating to get the background to that viral interview you had with Jordan Peterson for GQ magazine and what you make of the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson.
From his early work, which was about Jungian symbolism, he has kind of drifted from that into now an explicit Christian tradition, where I part ways with it. It's yoking it onto particularly that Americanized right-wing culture war. It's very weird that American right-wingers love the New Testament so much when Jesus' whole vibe in the New Testament is give it all away and just go wander around and be an itinerant preacher. Very hard to see how that yokes onto white evangelicals' huge support for Donald Trump, who is about as far from the teachings of the New Testament as I think any human has ever been.
I read your article with great interest on the ARC conference. There were different kind of visions of what the Conservative future could be. I guess we're at a point of these folk deciding, are we kind of allied to this very political answer, or is it about something that rises up from the ground in a faith kind of way?
There seems to be this idea of, well, if we put it in this apocalyptic myth, and that will help us to make sense of what's happening. Did you sense that there was this sort of bigger story wanting to be written?
There is a trend to kind of apocalypse baiting. People want to read about big arguments and they want to read about big fears.
You do see in some ways social causes, sexual, gender, race, the kind of communities that those foster and the intense passion having quasi-religious kind of nature to it. Are people managing to re-enchant their lives through those causes, or is it not enough? What do you think?
Welcome to another episode of Re-Enchanting, the podcast from Seen and Unseen. I'm Belle Tindall.
And I'm Justin Brierley.
And we, together with our guests, we ponder whether this materialistic, arguably disenchanted world is craving re-enchantment from the mystery and the wonder of the Christian faith.
Today, we're joined by Helen Lewis, who's a journalist, broadcaster, and staff writer for The Atlantic. She's the author of Difficult Women, A History of Feminism in 11 Fights, and has been writing and speaking about feminism, gender, and the culture wars for several years, and occasionally gets caught up in them herself.
So today, we'll be asking Helen about the religious instincts that seem to underlie secular activism on both the left and the right, and whether she sees any way forward in re-enchanting feminism, activism, and the culture wars of our day.
Welcome, Helen.
Hello, thank you very much for having me.
Well, I hope you're enjoying the view here on the top of Lambeth Palace Library. Because we do film this on top of a library, we always begin by asking our guests, what are you currently reading?
Well, I'm thrilled to be able to answer. For once, I'm reading a genuinely good book that I'm proud to say that I'm reading. I read a lot for work and quite often it's quite bad. But I'm reading Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, which won the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction, won the Women's Prize. It's a rewrite of David Copperfield, which is not a book. I don't think I've ever actually read it. I watched Amanda Iannucci's film of it with Dev Patel. And so there is occasionally a bit where you suddenly realise, oh, hang on a minute, this is Mr. McCall, hang on a minute, that's Uriah Heep. But I don't know the story well enough to actually know where all the beats are going to be. But it's set in Appalachia. So it's set among with people who would kind of refer to themselves as kind of white trash in the 90s. And it does a very good updating of what grinding poverty looks like now. You know, the things that Dickens was writing about and was interested in. What does that look like in the context of the opioid crisis, for example? Yeah. But it also does it in this very brilliant way without bashing you over the head with a message, right? Yeah. And I find that too much stuff now, people have got great convictions they want to convey in their art, and it can sometimes lead to extremely unsubtle art. And this doesn't do that. It's primarily a very human story first.
Right.
Yeah, that sounds great. I have not read that.
It's 600 pages, which I'm lucky I'm reading it on Kindle, so I didn't know this until I got involved.
So you weren't intimidated by the chunk?
I was not like, what about this? I did that with A Place of Greater Safety by Hilary Mantel, her novel about the French Revolution. Again, I read it on Kindle, and I'd been reading for about several hours. And I was like, I don't see you very far through this. And it was at that point it said, you are now 12% through 870 pages.
Yeah.
What have I done to myself?
Ignorance is bliss sometimes with the Kindle, isn't it? Just don't even look. Yeah. Don't even look how long you have left. I want to start on a heavy note.
Yeah.
Which is Taylor Swift.
Yes, good.
You really braced yourself for an actual philosophical... because your most recent piece for The Atlantic, or at least at the time of recording, is about Taylor Swift and in particular her new relationship with Travis Kelce.
Yeah.
And what do you sense in that relationship, also in culture's obsession with Taylor Swift?
Well, actually, there's a nice link here to this, which is that Travis Kelce, like many more Americans in public life, and I would say British people in public life, is publicly Christian. So among his many adorable old tweets is one that's about Easter, where he says, "Shout out to Jesus for taking one for the team."
I love it.
Wow.
Which is both you kind of wince, but you're also like, that is in some ways a very great summation of the Easter story.
Possibly quite theologically accurate in some ways.
So which I think is really interesting. And it's the same thing. Tomowato Olade wrote a brilliant piece for Unheard about black Christian congregations in Britain, pointing out that many high-profile footballers, are much more open about their faith. They come from cultures where they're much more open about faith, which isn't something you tend to see so much in British sports stars from perhaps a white British background. Yeah. And I thought that was really interesting because writing so much about America, which is so much more a faith-based culture, people are so much more overt in their displays of Christianity, is always an education to me living in, I think, what is, it feels like it's so much more dialed down in British public life. Yeah.
I read the article with interest. I'm afraid I'm not a Swiftie myself, but I know many people who are.
You are forgiven.
Including you, Belle.
Yeah.
But what does this phenomenon and the interest people have, obviously, in the love lives of Travis Kelce and Taylor Swift, what does this say about our kind of modern feminist culture?
Well, I think it's about community. And if you think about fame and fandom, they're sort of about the person that they're ostensibly about. But there's actually a huge thing about bonding with other people and having shared reference points and having an ability to stay in touch with people. I think that's the thing that really comes about from this is, when you talk about Taylor Swift concerts, people do have all kinds of rituals. So they talk about the fact there's a song where she talks about making friendship bracelets. So they make the friendship bracelets and they wear them to the concert.
Wow.
There are certain, they get very into wearing snakes because there's a whole plot line about she was called a snake and then she reclaimed the snake. And so there's a couple of things going on there. One of which is that it's like a soap opera in the sense of you've always got something low stakes to discuss with your friends. And two, there are all these kind of things that you can do together. You can get excited about announcing your Spotify list to people and sharing that kind of community with other people. And so much of the work that I've been doing for the last couple of years has been about that idea about whenever your life is lived online, what does a community look like? And is it as nourishing as an offline community? Is it in some ways a kind of poor substitute? Are there things about it that are sometimes better? Like if you've got a very rare niche interest, geographically, you might not be near anybody who shares that interest, but on the internet, you can find them instantly. So it has profoundly reshaped, I think, how communities form and how they function. Mostly, I would say, in quite negative ways, but occasionally in positive ways.
I was going to say, it almost feels like that there is a cult of Taylor Swift, but she's quite a benign cult leader. It's a sort of a nice...
She's using her powers for good. That's so far, I would say.
Seems to be having a positive impact on her audience.
Yeah. So, for example, Miss Americana, the documentary about her on Netflix, she agonizes about speaking out against Donald Trump because, she's got lots of roots with country music and very Trump-supporting bits of America and what it means to be a kind of political artist. And she's become very involved in efforts to get people to vote, for example. Yeah. Once you start thinking about cult dynamics, you do kind of begin to see them everywhere. It's a very natural human impulse to particularly be swayed by charismatic people, I think that's the thing, and want to follow them. And actually, to some extent, I can see why, the appeal of not trying to make an individual judgment on every single thing, every single issue out there, but to kind of delegate that to one person. There's a standard question in political polling, which is, does X share my values? It's one of those things where you look at a politician, you say, do they share my values? And that's not exactly cultish, but it comes from the same impulse, right? Which is the world is very complicated. And you look at this person, you just think fundamentally, are they like me? Do they care about people like me? That reduces down my decisions to a very narrow scope. And following a cult leader is an extreme version of that, where you let someone just decide what you wear and what you eat and where you sleep and all that kind of stuff.
You've done some work on gurus as well.
Yeah.
Would you see, is Taylor Swift a sort of guru of romance or of, girliness, adolescence? Do you see sort of, probably not as extreme as the examples you've tackled head on, but do you see little elements of that?
There's definitely a big intersection between the gurus that I studied in The New Gurus, which is my Radio 4 series, and self-help.
Okay.
And I think that's something that you see. And self-help isn't necessarily a bad thing, but I think when you look online, you begin to realize that people are always looking for answers. And they're looking for answers from Google. They're looking for answers from Quora. They're looking for answers from Reddit. And they are also looking for answers from big people who seem to have their lives sorted out. And so I think you're right. There's lots of stuff that comes through in those Taylor Swift songs, which is about being an outsider, which I find very hard to match up with the fact that she's now sort of effectively, prospectively a billionaire. Yeah, but the songs are so much about being the kid who's on the outside, not the popular kid at school, not the homecoming queen, all of that kind of stuff. And I think they really speak to people who, that's a pretty universal impulse. I'm always kind of fascinated to find out and try and talk to in adulthood who the popular kids in school were and what was that experience like? Because I don't think you ever meet anybody who goes, school was amazing. I was actually Queen Bee. That was when my life peaked. You're much more likely to meet people who did have that sense of not really kind of fitting in. And people have that throughout their lives, I think, that sense of being slightly on the outside. This is a very odd connection, but I just wrote an article about weight loss drugs and new weight loss drugs like Ozempic. And one of the guys who had lost a lot of weight in his 40s said to me, people do treat you better when you're more conventionally attractive. All my life, I'd had the sense that I was outside the velvet rope. And guess what? I was. Actually, it turned out I was. When you're more conventionally attractive, people do treat you better. Yeah. And I think a huge number of people who speak to them do have that sense that there is some kind of velvet rope and life is happening. The cool people are hanging out just somewhere that they aren't quite.
Yeah.
I think that's quite a universal experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Tell us a bit about your experience, Helen, because I remember when I listened to your BBC documentary summer of last year about the sort of whether social justice causes were kind of becoming akin to a new religion. You talked a bit about your own religious background, growing up in a Catholic environment, but sort of not embracing it yourself. I think you probably call yourself an atheist. If you call yourself anything, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I don't believe in God, and whether or not you want to put that down as agnostic. I mean, I presume to some extent everybody's agnostic and that nobody has proof one way or the other, but it's about your belief, and I would say I don't have the belief. But yeah, I made this program called The Church for Social Justice for Radio 4, and it was kicked off by Elizabeth Oldfield, who was then at Theos, the think tank, saying to me, do you think that, growing up in a Catholic environment, you replaced religion with feminism, which is something that I'd written about for 10 years. And it was interesting to me both that it was an interesting question. And it was also interesting that she seemed slightly nervous about asking it, that I would think it was slightly offensive in some way. Right. And I think there are people, when I made that program, actually generally Christians and Jewish people and other believers seem to quite appreciate it, find it quite interesting. Yeah. The people who were furious about it were the kind of rationalist atheists, who for them the idea of belief is irrational and their self-view of their politics is I'm a rational person, I've made rational political decisions. And to imply that there was any kind of emotional or spiritual component to it, to them was an offensive thing. So I now, through that process, understand what Elizabeth was getting at. But to me, I don't think it is offensive at all to say that these are both kind of moral questions. I think if you're talking about politics, most of the people would say, what do you want politics to do? Well, I want it to make people's lives better. I want it to improve the general condition of humanity. And so that is a kind of moral and spiritual quest. It's not just, you have to have some kind of overarching ethos into which to slot particular policy prescriptions. So that was my feeling about the links between the two of them.
Did you sort of ever have any inclinations towards religious belief in the traditional sense yourself? Or
I don't think I did. As I say, my dad is a deacon in the Catholic Church. My mum was an RE teacher. She was a Eucharistic minister. So I went to mass a lot. If it was going to take, it would have taken, and it really didn't. But the thing I do now, getting older, appreciate more about it is that sense of ritual and the sense of continuity and the sense of community. So the things that I went through my much more radical kind of new atheist phase in the 2000s. But the thing that came back to me is, for example, we would often at Christmas lunch have people round who didn't have anywhere else to go. Just a really simple thing, that I didn't really kind of appreciate as a child, or that my parents would go, they would do what they called hostel suppers for the homeless. They would go out and make sure that people were getting fed. And that sort of stuff that I think happens much more often during a religious framework, that we don't really even think about. That provides a kind of backbone of community to people who really wouldn't have anything else. And I do think the thing I have taken from Christianity is the idea that every human life is really worthwhile. It's not about like some people are life's winners and those people are rich and they deserve better things, or they're more intelligent so they deserve better things. The idea that people just by being alive are worthy of value, I think is something that, that is, I would say, the bit of Christianity that I hope I've clung on to despite my lack of belief.
Sure, yeah. And do you think, we've already touched upon it in Taylor Swift context, but do you think there's an element of belonging that people are searching for and then they find it in a particular social cause and everything that goes along with that?
Oh, hugely.
Yeah.
And I think you can, there's a quite a provocative political point, but I think you can in some ways trace American polarization. It's incredibly polarized politics. There's a whole load of structural reasons for that about states and the way that the country's set up from kind of minority rule. But some of it also is a bit of kind of post-Cold War malaise, right? The idea that the one thing that you were as an American is that you were not Russian, you were not communist. There was a very obvious external set of people that you weren't part of. And actually, in the absence of that, how do you define a community? And I think that's something that has happened to lots of people. People want to have a sense of who us is. And it's the job of politics to try and construct that in a positive way and an inclusive way, right? To say, this is Britain, we have this set of values, we're very welcoming to people. It's not about whatever it might be. It's not racially based, it's not faith based, but it is about this set of people, and this is who we are. And that's a really, really tricky thing to do. Historically, throughout history, that is not how humans have operated their tribal beliefs, right? And so that's why I find politics, particularly at this moment, really, really tricky and interesting.
And to that extent, you talk, obviously on that documentary about the way in which you do see, in some ways, some of those social causes, sexual, gender, race, the kind of communities that those foster, and the kind of the intense passion, if you like, that goes with it, having that kind of quasi-religious kind of nature to it. I mean, this show is called Re-Enchanting, and the idea is kind of playing on Max Weber's sort of living in a disenchanted world. And do you think that is a form of re-enchantment? Are people managing to re-enchant their lives through those causes, or is it not enough? What do you think?
I'm quite cynical about it in terms of party politics, because the two different examples of opposite ends of the political spectrum that I looked at were one, Trump rallies, Donald Trump's rallies, where people chanting "lock her up," having that collective effervescence experience, Emile Durkheim's phrase, and the other hand being the Jeremy Corbyn rallies on the left. The time when he went to Glastonbury and people are chanting, "Oh, Jeremy Corbyn." Yeah. They are clearly having this moment where they think, this is it, finally I've got a politician I can believe in. And I think in both senses, although people don't have a lot in common in any other way, they both felt a sense of like, oh, you're here, you're not exactly the Messiah, but a sort of secular Messiah, yes. Finally someone has come along that I can invest all my trust and faith in. And the problem with that is that politicians will inevitably let you down.
Yep.
They have to make compromises. They have to work within a party system. They have to work within an electoral system where they constantly have to be trimming their sails. And so it's really, really hard to invest that level of almost spiritual devotion in a kind of secular figure like a politician who is essentially a kind of deal maker. That's what a politician has to do.
Yeah, and you say in your book, which I finished on the train this morning, we'll totally get into it, but you say it specifically about feminist icons through history, but I think it's true that we want to erase thorny parts. We want to fit things into nice, neat boxes. We want history. We want definitive lines of good, bad, right, and wrong. And that doesn't quite work. Well, it doesn't work at all, I suppose, does it, when you map it onto human beings, because we are none of those things.
Right. We want saints, really. Yeah. That's what I write about in Difficult Women, is it is much easier to believe in. And actually, when you read the suffragette memoirs about Mrs. Pankhurst, the way they talk about her is as this kind of saintly figure of great wisdom who sort of occasionally passes among them. But, the real Mrs. Pankhurst was an incredible strategist. She was monomaniacally obsessed with the vote for women. She was not interested in doing poverty or Irish home rule or any of the other causes that were around at the time. Which unfortunately is also what made her a very successful campaigner, is being very headstrong, obsessive, non-compliant, quite difficult to be around. And that's those are all the things that make you an effective single issue campaigner. However, the desire to build people up into something, to be able to sort of worship them, requires you to pretend that all of the downsides of them don't exist. And in the case of Emmeline Pankhurst, we're talking about somebody who kicked her own daughter out of the Women's Social and Political Union because she was seen to be not focused enough on the main main thrust of the campaign. So she was ruthless. And can a saint be ruthless? Well, actually, if you look through the Christian tradition, quite a few saints were quite ruthless.
Yes.
And they were also sometimes not people you would necessarily have found very easy to live with or be around.
Yes. I mean, I've often thought St. Paul, we sort of have the stained glass window picture of St. Paul. I imagine he was quite a difficult person though, because the way if you read his letters in the New Testament, he's kind of, strikes me as quite an obsessive kind of character in some ways. And
he's not reluctant to tell people what to do, is he? Which
right, exactly.
And give them
he's not
guidance.
Backwards in coming forwards about that sort of thing. I guess, we do live in an age where people like to mythologize their heroes and so on. Someone who I've spent a bit of time thinking about, and you've actually done a sort of viral interview with, is one Jordan Peterson, who's sort of come to represent a very interesting kind of character in our culture, I find, who's on the one hand, obviously a bit of a political provocateur on social media, but also, has come to be regarded by many people as a sort of sage, and lots of young people, men especially, flocking to his lectures, and he talks quite eloquently in many ways about meaning and purpose and identity, and seems to be kind of pointing people back towards the Christian story quite often in sort of, at least for the psychological value of it. So first of all, I'd be fascinated to get the background to that viral interview you had with him for GQ magazine and what you make of the phenomenon of Jordan Peterson.
I think you've picked up on something really interesting, which is that from his early work, which was about Jungian symbolism. Maps of Meaning is all about interpreting dreams and about these kind of deep mythologies that lie behind stuff. He has kind of drifted from that into now, I would say, kind of an explicit Christian tradition. And it's very funny. I have a friend who's Irish Catholic who similarly to me grew up going to Mass all the time. And we just sort of occasionally say to each other, do you just not want to be so stressed about all this and just, have you not thought about going to Mass? It's like, religion has a lot to offer a lot of people. Yeah. And, instead of kind of going through these kind of great agonies of the soul, maybe you are religious, and that's fine. One of the best and most sympathetic reviews of 12 Rules for Life, which was the Jordan Peterson book that went absolutely mega viral, was by a blogger called Scott Alexander, who's a rationalist and atheist, saying that the thing he found it most similar to was the writing of C.S. Lewis.
Right.
Because it is all about that idea about struggle and suffering. And his idea of life that comes through very strongly from his work is that life is this kind of intense level of struggle and bad things happen to you. And, he has had in his life a series of health setbacks over people in his family. So I think it's kind of, you can place it in that tradition very, very easily. The thing that unfortunately for me, where I part ways with it, if people's personal faith, helps them, feels them grounded in their lives, I'm all in favour of that. It's yoking it onto particularly that Americanized right-wing culture war that's the problem for me. And that was what I found when I went to the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship conference, which he was involved in organising. It was a kind of strange dichotomy of very sweet, earnest Christians talking about, poverty and my mum would always say, like, do you understand that Jesus was basically a communist, right? It's very weird that like American right-wingers love the New Testament so much when Jesus' whole vibe in the New Testament is, give up
give it all away.
Give it all away and just go wander around and be an itinerant preacher and, turning over the tables in the temple and the moneylenders and and the parable of the Good Samaritan being that actually the high status people in society are often, the most horrible and thoughtless and selfish. Very hard to see how that yokes onto that particular form of American evangelical right-wing belief, particularly American white evangelicals, huge support for Donald Trump, who is about as far from the teachings of the New Testament as I think any human has ever been. But that was the strange thing to me about that art conference. It was, there were lots of people who were genuinely interested in things like poverty reduction from an explicitly Christian standpoint. And then there were people who were engaging in this sort of apocalyptic culture warring kind of stuff. And I think if you look at anything like, you look at the refugee crisis, the kind of Christian response to that, is very different to the right-wing culture war response to that. It's very much, these, when I was hungry, you fed me, all of that kind of idea that you get. I just find that abuse of Christianity, I would say in some ways, to be a constant feature of modern politics, particularly in America.
Yeah, I guess, I read your article with great interest on the ARC conference, the Alliance of Responsible Citizens. And it was, I wasn't there, but I saw some of the talks as well. And just as you describe it, it is almost like you weren't quite sure what the identity of this conference was. And there were different kind of visions of what the conservative future could be. And I guess we're at a point of these folk deciding, well, are we kind of allied to this very, I don't know, political answer to this? Or is it about something that rises up from the ground in a faith kind of way? Both voices seem to be present at the conference, but neither seem to have quite the
and you see that even within, I know most about the Catholic Church because I've been raised in it, about the kind of the current Pope coming from the Jesuit tradition, very much about poverty and obedience and not about flashy status symbols, and consciously rejecting a lot of the kind of Vatican sort of, pomp and circumstance, and how that slightly doesn't fit with some of the priorities of the American Catholic Church. I think I'm not so certain about the one here because I haven't looked into it, but I did feel like that about the fact that, which of these sides is going to win. And I would like it to be, this is coming from an atheist, I would like it to be the Christian side, because I felt that those people were talking actually in terms that I really agreed with, right? We'd arrived at the same principles, which is that you should look after other people. You do have a responsibility, if you've done well in life, to pass on that success and that joy to other people. I would rather live in a society that functions rather than in which 1% of people are winners and live in their gilded skyscrapers and everybody else is grubbing around in the dirt below them. Those things are really important to me, and I felt much more kinship with the people who were making those arguments.
That is interesting. I wasn't there, so I don't really have a right to speak, but from the little glimpses that I've caught, like online and things, there also seems to be quite a lot of mythologizing, in that things are confusing right now and complex. And so there seemed to be, but you can tell me that I'm wrong or that I'm only seeing things very narrowly. There seemed to be this idea of, well, if we put it in this apocalyptic myth, if we put ourselves, in this role and the people who disagree with us in this role, then that will help us to make sense of what's happening. Did you sense that there was this sort of bigger story wanting to be written?
I think that is a kind of classic form of kind of clickbait, right? Is that you can, having worked in news for a long time, if you sort of say the sky is falling in, people go, oh, I'd like to read about that. If you say, things are getting bad, things are bad, but sad, and the grand sweep of human history, you'd rather be born now than any previous time.
Yeah, sure.
People, it's not very clickable.
So newsworthy.
Yeah, so I think there is a trend to kind of eye-catching apocalypse kind of baiting. And I don't, I said in the article, I can't deprecate that because that is journalism does that too. I'm not entirely blameless. People want to read about big arguments and they want to read about big fears. And, they want a sense of kind of clash of identities and ideologies to clarify who they are and where they sit in relation to all of this. So, those aren't impulses that will ever entirely go away. And, there were good things about that too, in the sense that Paul Marshall, who's the hedge funder, who's an investor in Unheard and GB News, did talk about, from the perspective of somebody who's very, very rich, about the need to have ethical markets and some of the work that had been done about anti-monopoly stuff. I think that's one of the big curses about the fact that people who talk a lot about free markets, turns out are kind of basically fine with monopolies, which is the opposite of a free market. Right. And he was very much rebutting that and saying, good markets need good regulation. And so I would love it if I heard a bit more about that and a bit less of, woke atheists are trying to cancel Christmas, which I think slightly to some extent, that stand of kind of culture warring slightly makes everybody roll their eyes.
Sure.
I mean, it's an interesting thing though, because I do feel like a lot of the ground has shifted though, obviously in the last few years, and you've kind of been writing about that a lot because on the one hand, from the description you've given of the ARC conference there, you go in and you think, oh, this is conservative ways I'm not too, comfortable with in some respects.
Well, that's what I would say is one of the things that really drove me away from Catholicism, apart from my, agnosticism, atheism, was the church's attitude towards women priests and homosexuality.
Yeah.
And, what's really interesting is now when you go to conservative conferences, gay marriage is not up for debate now.
Well, I was going to say this is the interesting shift. So obviously now the hot button issues tend to be inevitably trans and other issues around critical race theories and that kind of thing tend to be what I don't know. I guess
and abortion in America, and not so much here.
Yeah. And to that extent, some people would label you a conservative, Helen, because you are more on the gender critical side of the feminist debate and so on, around issues like trans and so on. I mean, I saw just as I was sort of doing a little bit of research in advance of you coming in, that there was an event in Brighton that got cancelled where I think you were going to speak to, the name escapes me now, the author of Time's Up.
It was Hannah Barnes and Time to Think. We were going to talk to the Brighton Skeptic Society, which is very funny because that is a rationalist free thought group. And actually, bless the organizer who ended up going through an enormous amount of grief, has ended up resigning from that society, saying, I think the society's betrayed its principles. We were supposed to be here to be able to discuss things. And it turns out that some people here don't share those values. I would push back on you saying that I'm conservative in that, because I think what I am actually, I'm actually the progressive liberal side, which is that I say that you can be born with a certain set of chromosomes and act in any specific way.
Right.
And actually what I think is culturally conservative is saying if you are a somebody with XY chromosomes who wants to wear a dress, that's the thing that makes you a woman. People have gender dysphoria, really deeply felt sense of alienation from their own gender. They should absolutely be free to pursue that and live in whatever category they feel fits for them. But I don't like some of the rhetoric that we get about the idea that, I knew I was a girl because I wanted to wear makeup. Well, there's quite a lot of women out there who don't wear makeup, actually. And I think it's quite conservative to say that that's something that is innately female or associated with womanhood. But, these are really difficult waters to swim in, as you say. One of the difficulties I think that the British left has in talking about it is that if you look over to America, it has become an incredibly polarized issue. And you have right-wing politicians who are pursuing incredibly punitive, treatment bans, for example, even for adult transgender people, for whom I think, there should be much more latitude to make their own decisions. Obviously, children are a different category. But that completely that polarization clouds and ruins any possibility of discussion, because people feel that they are under attack, that people would rather they don't exist. And that's not a ridiculous fear, because we're just talking just after Russia has said essentially the promotion of LGBT issues is un-Russian, and it's something they want to crack down on. There have been similar statements by Polish politicians, Hungarian politicians. It is happening in Europe now that there are people who are anti-LGBT in this very overt way because they think it is sort of decadent and postmodern, and they would rather people live in a very old-fashioned set of gender norms. So those are not ridiculous concerns for people from those communities to have, I think.
Yeah. I suppose the issue is, where's the line because you don't want to cry cancel culture all the time when actually we do live in essentially a fairly free society and so on. But at the same time, there, you weren't, it's sad to hear that debate, that discussion at least was cancelled in Brighton. And what's your feeling about sort of where the lines are getting drawn in this country when it comes to
Well, there's a funny postscript.
discussing these issues?
There's a funny postscript to that story, which is that a feminist group has swooped in,
right, and
they have experience of organising events, gender critical events. So they already know how to liaise with the police, liaise with security, which I'm sorry to say many feminist events now need. And we are now doing the event with twice as many people able to come as previously were. There is a great appetite for people to have these discussions, and I think it's offensive and wrong to say that these are only people who are, falsely concerned or part of some kind of moral majority, or like, latter-day Mary Whitehouses, whatever that, the kind of things get thrown around. I think people genuinely do have concerns about, they just fundamentally want the facts, and they want to get a sense that they're going to get to hear, multiple perspectives on something like this, which is very new. And that's definitely how my feelings about things have matured in terms of free speech norms. When you have these big new questions, COVID being another example, I think you do have to have some kind of latitude to hear the arguments, as long as you're hearing them from people who are well-informed and arguing in good faith, right? Obviously, COVID being another similar example, there's a lot of people who know absolutely nothing, just reaping YouTube views out of this. But, there was a spread of opinion among credentialed scientists in the area, and you want that debate to be had out in the open and in a way that acknowledges the uncertainty. We're not going to blame anybody if they don't, if they're making their best guess on the available evidence. And so that is, I now feel quite strongly about freedom of speech, because I think you want to hear the best version of the minority view. Charlie Munger, the great investor who's just died, I think had this saying about, until you can articulate your opponent's case in a way that they would recognise, you don't really understand the issue. And I think for me as a journalist, and I'm sure you probably feel this too, you want to understand. You don't want to just say that other people who don't think the same as you are wrong or evil. You want to understand that what their priorities are that are different, or what the life experiences are that have got them to that point that are different. And you should be able to articulate that.
Do you think that part of the issue as well is that this discussion is being monopolised by people who, for example, have never, ever advocated for women's sports before? People who have actively said female athletes shouldn't be paid the same as male athletes. But now it's a hot topic that they can kind of get on. And so they're speaking about, transgender athletes and all of that. So do you find that is it frustrating for you when you want to have these conversations and you want to have them in as gracious and informed and free a way as possible, that sometimes they're hijacked by people who aren't informed, but also they may not be speaking up for women like women assume they are?
Oh, yeah. No, I think that, you're entirely right to identify the fact that some of the pushback to evolving gender norms comes from people who have this very old-fashioned idea about what men, women are and what they should do that is fundamentally kind of anti-feminist in the way that I would say, women are just like this and men are just like this. And actually, I would argue there's a pretty broad spectrum with some overlaps. And actually, most people are not stereotypes. They're a mixture of stuff. So yeah, I agree with you. But this is you must have these in discussions of faith as well, is that you have to, it feels like you're walking down a very narrow tunnel with people sort of screaming at you from both sides and throwing kind of Molotov cocktails into your path, which you have to dodge. That is the condition of having any kind of discussion in an era in which everybody gets their say in a very unfiltered way. Yeah. And that's got, as somebody who's kind of very privileged to be able to have a writing position, I know that my voice is elevated. So from the people on the sidelines, they feel they probably have to scream pretty loudly to get heard at all. But that is my experience of writing about difficult and contentious issues. It might be Israel-Palestine, it might be gender, it might be abortion, it might be anything. Is you have to kind of maintain a level of focus as people try and drag you off and try and raise the temperature of the conversation constantly too.
I mean, could you sketch a picture of how you see the ground now lies when it comes to feminism? I mean, and I guess it's going to probably look a bit different in the UK to the US or wherever. What kind of, could you draw a picture of where those lines lie now? Because a lot of people feel like it's a constantly moving thing at the moment. It's so fast in our culture.
I mean, it's been an incredibly successful movement. I write this in Difficult Women. If you look back in, just over 150 years ago, women didn't have the right to go to university. They didn't have the right to vote. They couldn't control their own fertility. There were jobs like magistrate that were just barred to women. It has been brilliant at smashing down those barriers. And what was easier in the early ways, not easier in the sense of it was equally hard fought, but intellectually the case is easy to make, say, we want to be treated exactly the same as men. So we want to vote like you get the vote. That, I think, is a case for equality that people can either reject or accept, but it's a very simple case to make. Say, we want to be full citizens, we want to be able to do all these jobs. What's more difficult now is that you're getting situations in which biology is really relevant. Yeah. And that's always been a really vexed question, because women don't want to be defined by their biology, because it's been traditionally used to say, well, of course, you've got your wandering womb, so you can't make decisions, or, whatever it might be, or women just naturally want to do X, Y, Z because of their hormones. And so there's wrestling with the kind of the facts of biology, but also saying sometimes we're going to need to be treated differently. And women's sport is a really good example of that. And actually, I think it's one that, a subject of gender that men find it much more easy to talk about, because, the stats are really obvious. If you've been through male puberty, you are just stronger on average. You're going to be able to run faster. You're going to be able to lift much. I've been trying to do a pull-up now for a year and training quite intensely to that. And I still can't do it. Women's upper body strength compared to men's is just, it's just completely
I can only do one if that helps.
But that's what I mean. Yeah, most men can do one pull-up, which is very, very upsetting. My husband walked into the gym after like years of being out and just went and did, and I was just like, I hate you. Been here for months. But that is just a very stark difference. Now there's a lot of there's also a lot of grey areas within that, right? So, for example, you might want to treat trans men, so biologically female people who then take testosterone and go through male puberty that differently, because you are going to get some of the benefits of that, but not all of the benefits of that. So, things aren't that simple binary. You do have to take that into account. But that's where feminism is not struggling exactly, but it's having to make more sophisticated or complicated, less straightforward equality-based arguments. Thinking about something less controversial like menopause policies at work. And there's a big argument, really, which I don't know where I sit on, about, obviously you want to take into account, you don't want to lose women from the workforce because of this transient phase, but also you don't want to treat all women like they're kind of delicate little objects. And a lot of discussion about pregnancy is the same, right? Is the sense that this is to some extent a natural process. You need to be not, terrified of it, but it is also a natural process that has historically killed a lot of women through history. So you do need to be respectful of that, and you do need to make allowances for that. So that's where the ground is. The interesting thing is some of the other stuff that's coming up now, I think will be very interesting to people who are concerned with the dignity of the human person. So regardless of where you stand on abortion, I know that's a very contentious issue, surrogacy presents a lot of the same issues. Yeah. And I think it's often been people from Christian backgrounds who've been talking about their concerns about commercial surrogacy. It looks like the government has rejected moving towards a more commercial network. There are countries in the developing world which have rolled back their previous policies because it seemed to be so exploitative. It was rich people coming in and basically deciding that they own somebody for the duration of that pregnancy.
The rent-a-womb, as it's called.
Right, exactly. Yeah. America is, being America, in lots of states, fine with commercial surrogacy. And, there isn't really an organised resistance to that in America. It would be a very strange situation. And once again, in the same with, say, with gender, that actually British feminists end up being the ones who are articulating a very biology, material-based critique of some of those issues.
I am speaking about your book. Like I say, I finished it on the train this morning. And so the final little epilogue, I suppose, is a manifesto for a difficult woman. It made me think of, I mean, there's lots of quotes about difficult women, but Jane Goodall, I think she says it doesn't take much to be a difficult woman. That's why there are so many of us. But anyway, I was reading your manifesto and it made me feel a bit teary.
Good.
Actually, yeah, in the same way that America Ferrera's speech in the Barbie movie made me feel a bit teary. I don't know if I should be admitting this. And there's a Taylor Swift song called The Man, which again makes me feel a bit teary. And I think, will you cringe out of your skin if I just quote a tiny bit?
Maybe a bit, but go on. I'll drink my tea and try not to.
So the whole manifesto, it's like 2 pages long and it's so beautiful and it just outlines what a difficult woman is and what a difficult woman is not. And there's just these few lines where you say she feels an affinity with other women, the texture of their lives and experiences. She believes that whatever separates them is less important than what unites them. She listens to women who have been places she will never go, perhaps including the strange country called motherhood, and knows that their choices are not a commentary on her choices. And I love those few lines so much because I think one of the accusations thrown towards modern feminism is how individualistic it is. And that doesn't seem to be, both within your thoughts within this book, but also in the historic, the 11 fights that you outline. You seem to place your feminism utterly and completely rooted in community. Can you talk to us a little bit about that feminism and community as opposed to feminism as an individualistic identity?
Yes, I call it the kind of you go girl, we don't have enough female dictators. We don't have enough female serial killers. Like, when will we finally achieve equality in all these professions that we've historically lagged behind in? And I think that is the reductio ad absurdum of some of those ideas of very individualistic feminism. The idea that, and I think it's probably because it's a marketing technique, but the kind of like, you can't now boast about having done stuff. I mean, maybe you can if you're American, less so if you're British, we cringe too much. But instead it's like, I was so pleased to be the first woman to do X. And you're like, actually, aren't I amazing? Is the subtext of that. But obviously if I just wrote, I'm really amazing, well done me. But then if you've you framed it as a victory for all women.
Right.
And it's actually, I'm not sure that 90% of women think that you becoming, CEO of this blockchain company really feel a benefit from that, actually. Thank you. So yeah, I think that was what I was reacting against, was that idea of feminism as a marketing tool, which has ebbed back a bit now. I think we're now in a period of kind of slight backlash, but there was a bit where it was a branding exercise. And, I was really interested to write about trade unions, which I think are a kind of fascinating, imperfect tool for advancement. And there's a story of Jaya Bandesai in that, who came over from via Tanzania from Gujarat and was working in a photography laboratory, and which was primarily filled with both migrant labourers and lots of young male students and lots of older women. So they were people who were deemed not to be able to kind of advocate for themselves. And they did, and her fight ultimately failed, but it did lead to a huge discussion about the fact that the trade unions at the time were very white and male dominated. Were they doing enough for women? Were they doing enough for migrant labourers? And so that was one of the fights I was really keen to include, because it was a collective struggle.
Sure.
And I think that, the kind of superpower of humanity is our ability to form communities. It is what meant that we managed to, everything that we can see here, no one could build the Palace of Westminster on their own. We have to see ourselves more as being kind of ants in the anthill. And I wanted to write about that, about the kind of the joy of that and the kind of sense of community and communion that you feel by plugging away at something really intractable. And, you mentioned my controversial, nature to some extent. And that has been really hard, to find out that people think that you hold opinions that you don't feel that you hold, is a gross experience. I wouldn't recommend it to anybody. The one thing it does do is give you a huge sense of people who are on your side. It makes you really understand. And I think, if you see that through communities through history that are facing struggle or outside forces, that it binds you together. You have the most meaningful relationships of your life when they are under pressure. In the same way, we're Catholic, so I'm part of a big family. And, we've had some family health difficulties this year, and that has really bound us together. Yeah. And it has made me appreciate having a family and having siblings in a way that I hadn't before, because there's been that outside tension. And so the duality of feminism is that often for women, it's, the suffragettes had cabbages thrown at them and they were mocked in all of these other ways. But when you read their memoirs, they talk about it as the most meaningful time of their lives. A lot of them talk about it like joining an army, that they were living these lives they never would have expected. They were doing something bigger than they ever expected. And they were forming friendships that Annie Kenney and Constance Lytton I write about, and they came from very different backgrounds, the mill girl and the aristocrat. And yet, even 10 years after it was over, they would still write to each other because they'd been through this thing together. And I think that's such a powerful experience. That kind of, psychologists talk about the difference that some people have post-traumatic stress syndrome, lots more people have post-traumatic growth. The idea that when you've been through something really awful, actually quite a lot of the time you will emerge with this renewed sense of purpose or clarity about what is meaningful in your life. And I think that's the same thing with being part of a political movement. And I presume it's the same being part of a faith community too.
I think there's a lot of overlap with that. One thing I did want to ask you about, Helen, is in our first season of Re-Enchanting, we had Louise Perry on the show, who I'm sure you know. And she obviously has written this book, The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. And I think in some ways her argument is that the problem sometimes with the modern feminist movement is that it thinks it's a win if women become more like men. But her point in the book really is that actually, when it comes to sexual activity, it's not in women's best interest to act like men. And interestingly, she comes to quite, in a sense, traditional conclusions, quasi-Christian conclusions in a way, about actually perhaps we should have a return to monogamy and chastity and that kind of thing in our culture. And I think she's sort of been going on something of a spiritual journey at the same time. She spoke to us a little bit about sort of, her feelings on that on the show. And then I notice other people in that same sort of sphere, Mary Harrington, Barry Weiss, arguably reconnecting with her Jewish faith. I don't know whether there's any overlap with where you are at, but obviously for some people, they are kind of putting a certain form of feminism together with a certain sort of Christian ethos. What do you make of that phenomenon, if it is one?
No, I think it is a real phenomenon. I interviewed Louise for the Radio 4 interview series I did, The Spark, about that book. And it was really interesting to me because lots of what she said I found very compelling, and lots of it I disagreed with. The first thing I think I disagree with is I think she relies on a kind of nostalgia for a world that never existed. Right. My favourite period of history to study was the 18th century. And it was really a lot more like now than you would think. And even the Victorian era, in which everyone was supposedly hiding their table legs because they were incredibly prudish, there was also an incredibly huge underworld. Think about the world that Dickens writes about of prostitutes in London. Yeah. There was, I think it was more like today in the sense of a kind of sickly level of morality over people indulging some pretty base desires. So that is my, when we talk about the fact that people didn't used to have sex before marriage, well, actually, if you start looking, it turns out that people had some pretty interesting definitions of what counted as sex, and in 16th century, 16th and 17th century England, and then they kind of sort of licensed themselves in those ways, I think there's a part of that. I think there's a kind of nostalgia in that vision, which I don't necessarily think is warranted. And also, I think the fundamental difference between my thinking and Louise's thinking is I am much more fundamentally a liberal than she is. I don't think everybody has to be the same. And I think what's right for me is not necessarily right for everybody. And I'm very wary of attributing things that make me happy and saying, well, that's the way that the whole world should be. And, and I think she's much more comfortable saying, I found the one true way. And this is what will make you happy. But I think, I think it's what's good about both her and Mary Harrington's thought is that they are both very good and provocative writers who have a great clarity of thought. And I enjoy reading them both for the same reason, which is that you understand more what you think when you kind of sharpen your knife on a tool like that, which is that, and Mary writes very compellingly in her book about the kind of, she calls it meat Lego, the idea that we treat our bodies in this way, that we aren't really part of them, that they're endlessly modifiable. And I think that's a really good
meat Lego. Is so gross.
And then she talks about meat Lego Gnosticism, which is sort of like a great, just anyway. But the idea that you get from being online and that critique about the fact that your body doesn't really matter. I've been thinking thinking about that a lot as well in terms of identity. The idea that when we got online, we were just all going to be brains in a jar. You were just going to swim in this thing where only your opinions mattered. And actually, what I think has happened is that people have been desperate to pile back labels onto themselves. You know, the kind of phenomenon of those people's bios where you see where it lists sort of everything that they've, down to what they had for breakfast as a way of defining themselves. People want to have those badges on themselves. And I think Mary writes very compellingly about that feeling that, the brain in a jar thesis has been debunked. People don't really want that. And they try and recreate some of the experiences of the offline world. You mentioned, who was the other person you mentioned?
Well, I also mentioned Barry Weiss.
Yeah.
Who, again, is an interesting character. And the reason I kind of put those three together, Mary, Louise and Barry, is that I've seen them all sort of become a bit more explicit about faith alongside their commitments to, feminism, although they all arguably lean a bit more conservative than
I do, certainly. Yeah. I also think that I'm not sure whether or not any of them grew up in a religious as opposed to, I know Barry is culturally Jewish. I'm not sure where she grew up in a particularly observant family. And certainly the way that Mary writes about her 20s seems to have been a lot more exciting than mine. And I think one of the reviews said, the book reads like the kind of Confessions of a Justified Sinner. Right. I think there's definitely a sense, again, with her that she's been through this journey and she's now on a different path. And I don't think I have that, having come from a Catholic background. Right. There wasn't a sense that I kind of suddenly went, oh, religion, hang on a minute, never tried that before. For me, that was always part of my drumbeat growing up. But I think Barry Weiss is a very interesting example, because I would say particularly, she has always been interested in Israel, and she got into a lot of trouble in her career in the liberal media for those sympathies. But I think that since the October the 7th terror attack by Hamas, she's become a lot more invested in the idea of Israel, and also in her Jewish faith. I think particularly having kids maybe has affected this. And that's something that I think about a lot, because Gary Young's brilliant book on identity, which is called Who Are We?, says that you most feel your identity when it's under attack. So if you have uncertain immigration status, when someone asks to see your papers, or when you're, do I feel like a woman very much in my everyday life? Not enormously, except, if I got catcalled or someone was obviously dismissive of me in a way that I just thought, you're just the next I'm a woman. And it reminds you, and I think probably in all three of their cases, in kind of different ways, they feel that they are embattled, or that they are making a minority case, an unfashionable case. And in that case, that is something that will often make you, I think, feel your identity more strongly.
Yeah. So much of what you're saying can be brought back to identity and can be brought back to belonging. And that seems to be like a real recurrent theme, which I don't have a question about. I'm just finding it really interesting. But
well, you end up with your writing, that you end up writing a lot about stuff, and you end up realizing that you've been writing about the same things, and they're obviously, and you don't necessarily appeal to it. But you're right. For example, I'm really interested in in the ways that we trick ourselves, or the ways that we don't understand ourselves. So I've written about things like people who there was a spate of American academics who passed themselves off as being from minority racial backgrounds, and they were actually white, and the kind of motivations to why you might do that, which weren't grifting, they weren't charlatans as far as I can see. It sprang from a genuine feeling that they identified with oppression and being oppressed, and they were sympathetic. And that tipped over into thinking, I'm actually part of those groups, which is really fascinating, right? The idea that you don't just pass yourself off as black, but you also go and join the NAACP. You always get involved in activism and civil rights activism. That sort of stuff is very interesting to me. I wrote about, during the pandemic, there was a spate of what looked like Tourette's tics that were sweeping across TikTok particularly. And the way they could work out that it was definitely being fed by influencers on TikTok was there was a girl in, I think, St. Helena, which is an island in the middle of absolutely nowhere in the sea with about 100 people on it, who was having the same tic as a very popular influencer saying beans.
Right.
And so you had this situation where, and these tics seem to have abated now, the stress of the pandemic, being separated from all your friends, doing all your lessons online, spending all this time with people, not to go too Freudian about it, but the idea that people's anxiety was welling up and kind of turning into these expressions, these tics, and how you should deal with that. Again, these people were not putting it on, right? They were not charlatans. They were not fraudsters. They weren't aware of what they were doing. They were expressing themselves in this way. They weren't fully, this need was welling up within them. And that's, again, why I find faith really interesting. What are the compulsions that take people into feeling there's something missing in their lives, or there's something that they get spiritually that they don't get materially? the psychology of that is always interesting.
Yeah. Well, those are the types of things we kind of probe on Re-Enchanting. This idea of why aren't we and people would argue against the idea that we're in Weber's disenchanted reality. But if we are, why don't we feel like we've made it? Like, why aren't we satisfied with that? If everything is rationalized and we can understand and grasp and contain and explain everything, why aren't we happy? Or happy with that? Why are we seeking re-enchantment?
Because people you love will still die and they'll still get sick for no reason.
Yeah.
Things will still happen that you have no reason for, that you can be a good person and bad things will happen to you. I just think the world is fundamentally chaotic, and you can intellectually understand that, but it still feels wrong, doesn't it? And I think...
Absolutely.
To some extent, I think maybe we've replaced religion with conspiracy theories. And it does a similar job of organizing the world in a way and a pattern. So instead of the kind of your medieval plowman would have said it's God's will that the crops have failed, now somebody says it's because the Hollywood elite is drinking adrenochrome that this has happened. And it functions in a similar way. And I hope that isn't offensive to you as believers.
Not in the least, but I think you've put your finger on that conspiracy theories essentially function because they give people a sense of explanation and order to some things that are often more complex. And yeah, absolutely, religious belief, I think, can be like that as well. I suppose the problem with whether they be conspiracy theories or these kind of social justice movements or on the left or right, taking the place of largely the Christian story is that they take the worst bits, the judgmental kind of, all out, proselytizing, zealotry.
And the identification of heretics.
Absolutely.
But without the bit where it's not really up to you, it's up to God.
Exactly.
He's the only one who can judge people.
Right? Interesting,
I think Tom Holland said something like this when we had him on some time ago, that the problem is that he likes, in a sense, original sin as a doctrine in Christianity because it's kind of equalizing. He says, well, we're all fallen. We're all, none of us are going to get this right. And so you have to have capacity for forgiveness, for grace, because you're actually just as sinful as the person next to you in the end. There's none of us are, a saint. We're all sinners at some level as well. So I guess, you mentioned at the beginning, some of the things you do appreciate about the Christian tradition. Is that one area where you would say, yeah, Christianity probably rather have that than some of these more heretical type, or heresy hunting sort of versions of quasi-religion in our culture?
I find that the story of Jesus is genuinely inspiring in that it is a story of somebody who people want to turn into, a guru. They want to put him on a throne, and he consciously rejects that. He lives the very humble lifestyle. He does, he sleeps with everybody else in the kind of communal thing. It is about a rejection of material goods and wealth, and I find that really. That is really, that idea of humility, particularly, that you get in that tradition, I find really inspiring. And the idea that, that there is some worth of people beyond their intelligence or their wealth or whatever it might be. And one of the things that I think is genuinely interesting about studying the Bible, if you look at the Old Testament, right, being special is almost always bad. Being chosen by God generally leads to, I would say, a downturn in your fortunes. You're asked to sacrifice your eldest son, or subjected to a plague of frogs, or eaten by a whale. And the consistent lesson is that being chosen is not something to kind of brag about. It still requires you to be in a state of humility. And then that's carried through to the New Testament too. And so I think those lessons are the ones that when I, still occasionally I will go to church at Christmas or to a carol service or something like that, that I try and kind of think about, even though, as I say, I'm not a believer.
Well, Helen, that's been the quickest hour ever. Thank you so much. It's gone by so fast, and it's been so interesting, the themes that run through your week, but also the really interesting specifics.
We did go from Taylor Swift to the New Testament.
My two favourite subjects.
Right.
And we didn't get to talk about my favourite article of yours from the past year, which was the Satanic Temple one, but maybe next time we can get into the politics of the Satanic Temple. For now, thank you so much for Re-Enchanting Feminism with us today on the show.
Thank you for having me.